In this episode, I bring back one of my favorite writers and guests. JD Edwin is a science fiction and urban fantasy author who believes the first goal of fiction is fun. She's the author of the Headspace series, an easy to read, action packed science fiction trilogy published by Story Cartel Press. JD aims to entertain the reader, and she embraces Stephen King's philosophy of every word should be the story. JD is Chinese by birth and also hopes to bring underrepresented Asian voices to the fantasy sci fi genre. That's just scratching the surface. JD has been teaching people how to increase their productivity as writers, and she's written numerous short stories and articles on the craft of writing. Our first chat was 2 years ago, just after she had published the first in her Headspace series. And then I had her back a year later after she published the second. She's not only completed that series, but she's on to another series. One thing that I really was intrigued about was JD's use of non binary storytelling. She doesn't describe characters by gender. At first, when I was reading her book, it was challenging because my mind was seeking to quickly filter characters by gender. But think about it, it's not really needed to know the gender. This is just a habit of ours. After a while, my imagination felt liberated by not needing to know the gender. There are so many other traits and descriptions of characters and their behavior that have nothing to do with gender. It's just freeing. It turns out that it is limiting to know the gender sometimes because of all the prejudice and unconscious beliefs that go along with the label. So you're freer to get to know the core traits of the character without this detail. I had just never thought about this before. If you haven't read a book written in this way, I suggest giving it a try with the first in the Headspace series. Besides being objectively excellent books with great world building and character development, it's an opportunity to have a new reading experience. It also reminds me of when I read the book Clockwork Orange about 10 years ago, which was written in an urban slang that you had to give into, surrender to, and allow your intuition to understand what was being said. It was like the more I tried to understand it and translate, the harder it was to actually truly understand what was being communicated. I had to immerse myself in the words. It was really an interesting experience. But half of the women in my book club were too frustrated. They couldn't even get through the book. Their loss. Today, we're going to talk about the intersection of vulnerability and creativity. I'll start with this truth. The unconscious, personal and collective unconscious, seeks to create. Your unconscious seeks to create. Create what, you might ask? Well, sometimes it's a literal human being, but there are so many other ways we create. We bring a new perspective to an old idea. The book The Secret did not contain new ideas. Rather, they were ancient ideas that were presented in a new way during a new time that resonated with a whole new demographic of people who had never heard of those ideas. We create new businesses, new inventions, new combinations of healing modalities. And of course, there are what you might think of as conventional artistic expressions like music, visual art, film, poetry, songs, and dance. There are big archetypal energies that are seeking willing vessels, human beings, through which to flow and create new expressions of these energies, like love, for example, or ideas about the feminine and masculine, or experiences of grief or processes of transformation. The unconscious seeks to create to expand consciousness, which is always about expanding love. The hero's journey might be an archetypal experience you've heard about. There's an inciting incident, antagonistic characters, an unraveling, helper characters, the meeting of inner demons that bring new insights that are integrated into one's life, and finally, a circling back to community to share wisdom. Our trauma or wounds or adverse experiences are always doorways to the deeper archetypal energies that manifest as unique expressions of being human. During our lives, we are always navigating two journeys, the one towards self, capital S, and the one towards being accepted by the collective. Our psychological DNA contains the entire history of humanity's experiences. This is why suddenly at some point in your life, you might recognize a pattern that began generations before you that you never noticed until this moment, or why images show up in people's dreams that have nothing to do with the personal experience or even their ancestry. Science now recognizes that humans are meant to deeply connect, and that deep connection between humans cannot happen without mutual vulnerability. Allowing yourself to be swept up in a new, ironic, irrational love affair is agreeing to be a willing vessel through which creative intelligence wants to flow to prompt psychological and spiritual growth of two human beings. The transformative nature of the experience depends upon the consciousness by those two people that there is an unconscious agenda for the relationship that can only be known by willingly going through the intense ups and downs and ultimately learning the lessons presented, which then prepares you for an even higher relationship experience. What does it mean to be vulnerable? It's suffering through the state of being unsure, uncertain, being open to chance and risking rejection in the pursuit of deeply connecting to your deeper self or another. Vulnerability starts with embracing awkwardness, that state of intense self consciousness. Courage isn't needed for certainty. Courage is needed to proceed with something that feels psychologically dangerous. Courage is needed to withstand the discomfort of feeling exposed and naked as you withstand the anxiousness of trusting something that is part of you, but bigger than you and knows more than you about your future. It was JD's idea to talk about this topic. It seems our first chat a couple years ago inspired her journey to get to know herself a little deeper. So let's get started. So, welcome back, JD.
Thank you. Very excited to be back here again.
I am so happy to have you again. And I thought we could start with just having you catch us up on your life. I know it's been a couple of years since our first chat, and I'm going to share links for those two chats. And I always want to also emphasize that we got to know each other through the wonderful online writing program called The Right Practice. Check it out. And so, yeah, so before you catch us up on what's been going on and also how you've changed, that kind of led to us determining the topic for today. I forgot to say to my viewers and listeners that I would really appreciate you liking and rating, whether it's the podcast or the YouTube version, because it really does help get it to other people. And also, if you like my free content, I produce it all by myself, and I am trying to uh, recruit some more people to become monthly donors at like $5. It helps out. So, anyway, take it away, JD. What's been going on?
Well, thank you. So it's hard to believe that it's been a couple of years since the first time we chatted. And since then, I finished publishing my Headspace trilogy. I taught several classes on book planning, on productivity, on writing conflicts, various aspects of writing. I also published a nonfiction under J. Danforth. I've written a bunch of short stories, a bunch of articles. My publishing contract with Story Cartel Press is over now because we were contracted for the trilogy. And I decided that rather than going with another small press or self-publishing, I'm gonna give querying another shot. I'm trying to get an agent again, and that's what I'm in the process of doing right now. And I think the experience of small publishing and self-publishing has taught me that I'm not made to wear all those hats. I know there are some people who are, you are one of those people, and you are well aware of how much work that is as well. And I've kind of decided that's not for me. I don't have the capacity for that. So I'm currently shopping my new romantasy around. It's called Love, Death, and Other Things I'm Bad At. So it is being sent out to agents right now. I'm also doing some in-person pitches to agents. But overall, I'm actually trying to slow down a little bit because these last few years have been super, super intense. And I suppose in line with today's theme of vulnerability, this is me being vulnerable and admitting that for a few years there, I was teaching people productivity and touting this whole productive writer lifestyle. In reality, I was kind of having a bit of a mental breakdown because I was trying to cope with the pandemic and it just drove me into workaholism. So I'm trying to back off a little on that right now.
Well, thank you for sharing that because, COVID did affect us
It did.
and it manifests in so many different ways. And, I always thought you were like the definition of intensity. Like just listening to you teach one of those courses on increasing your productivity as a writer, I was like, oh, I don't know if I can do that. So I'm also so excited for you to sort of evolve into, the next level of being taken on by an agent and a bigger publishing firm. And I think all your prior work, yeah, in a way prepares that for you. So,
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
so yeah. So I'm so intrigued by your thoughts about vulnerability that just came up and its intersection with creativity. It got me so excited. And I often describe creative people as vessels, right? And sometimes they sense that something's flowing through them. And sometimes they're so not aware. And you're like, wow, it sounds like you're really open to like the archetypal realm. And they're like, no, I'm just writing from my mind. Right. So, but you can feel it. I've had the experience. And, those times when, like today, I wrote my intro a couple of days ago and sent it to you and whatever. And then today I needed to record it. And I was like, oh, I love this. Like, did I write that? It just came out. And in the moment, it just kind of floods out. And then I usually walk away and come back and look at it. And in most cases, like when I write blog posts, I'm like, I'm not changing a thing. And I know that I didn't write it alone, that there's this other presence involved that's like part of us, but bigger than us. So it's, I mean, it's just such a cool experience. So anyway, just go wherever you want to go with that. And also like, when was this moment that you, and what happened that you gained this insight about this intersection between vulnerability and creativity? Tell us a story.
So originally, when we planned to talk about this topic, I was only looking at my recent
Hmm.
experiences from the last few years. But when I sat down and thought about it, I was like, creativity has always been a vulnerable thing. And I thought all the way back to when I was a teenager, being 16 years old, and I was messing around on fanfiction.net. Right? That's where I first started really taking writing a little more seriously. And I remember just being this lurker on the side and reading other people's stories until I decided I'm going to try this. And it's a really vulnerable moment to really put your own work out there to be judged. And the fact is, something like fan fiction, it's like a semi vulnerability
Mm.
because you are going into an audience that already loves the source material of what you're basing off of. So it's a slightly less vulnerable situation, but it's still a matter of really putting your work out there. But I didn't really start to understand vulnerability till I started publishing my own books. And I realized that I was laying myself out there. I was telling the world, this is what I like to write. This is a story that represents not just my skills, but my tastes and who I am.
Mm.
And it wasn't until recently that I started to identify that feeling is being vulnerable because I used to just see that as a lack of confidence. It's
Oh.
not, it's vulnerability. There's so many layers to putting your work out into the world. It's showing the world you. It's not just saying, here's my work. It's saying, here I am.
Mm. Oh, I really like that. Ooh, this is something new to chew on because many people, creative people, will think it is a lack of confidence
Mhm.
issue. And if you had a lack of confidence, you actually wouldn't even be doing it, right?
Right.
But so it almost like goes hand in hand that you have to enter the space of vulnerability
Yes,
and you have
absolutely.
to suffer through the discomfort of it. And that's what contributes to the creative expression. Yeah. I like it. So, and this leads to a really great natural next question, which is during our chat, you mentioned being raised in a shame based culture. And I thought, wow, that's such a strong statement. So I wonder if you could tell us more about that and how it impacted your creative expression. And clearly it didn't stop you, although maybe it's been a long process of sort of overcoming it. But I would say, I do believe C.G. Jung, one of the founders of depth psychology, who says, that pattern or whatever that is, the pattern of reaction to response, where we feel that twinge, um, we never really overcome it. And in fact, if we just banish it to the shadow and not pay attention to it, it will come up when we don't want it to. So it's really more about relating to it and partnering with it to unfold the way that you want to unfold. And so, how has your relationship with shame, is how I kind of like to think about it, changed? And I love this question you say you now ask yourself, if I were not shaming myself right now, what would I create? I mean, it's so powerful. And you also are this living example. And now you're becoming aware of how these creative intelligence, archetypal energies uses our wounds, uses that very whatever it is, that wound, to expand not only your consciousness, but then through your creation expands the consciousness of others. So, yeah, tell us more about your relationship with shame.
I didn't really identify shame as a major role in my life until I read Brene Brown's
Mm,
Daring Greatly, and it brought a lot of clarity to my life. I am Chinese and I came from a culture that's very shame based. I've had to sit and evaluate how much I've internalized this
mm,
fear of being vulnerable. And I realized that I tend to react to any kind of criticism with shame. Even if I welcome feedback, like, I invited beta readers to read my books. I don't have to do that. But I did, which means I welcome what they have to say. But my initial reaction is still shame. Is if they tell me something needs to be fixed, I feel ashamed
mm.
for it. And I still have this fear of, if I were ever to receive a negative review on my book, which unfortunate, I haven't received a whole lot of those. But if I got a really negative review, I worry that I'm gonna just let the shame overcome me. And even in the process of writing, when I'm getting feedback from my editor, who by the way is amazing, it still feels like there's a degree of shame in it, even though I hired her to give me feedback. It's this reflex. And I find that every time I get feedback, I have to work through the shame first before I can really do the work of it. And now that I know this, I'm working on getting through this step faster or just skipping it because, there's really no need for shame.
Yeah.
Shame is a very wasteful feeling to have. It doesn't contribute to anything except to make you feel bad. And I actually posed this question about how people feel about vulnerability and shame and creativity on my recent newsletter. And I want to share a few great responses that I
Oh,
got.
terrific. Great.
So from Miriam, she said, I struggle with being vulnerable because there are parts of me I'm honestly afraid to show. Having reached the ripe old age of 63, it's easier either to tell the voice in my head, it doesn't matter what someone thinks of me, that I don't need to be afraid of my creativity.
Mm,
And I really love that. And it's a little sad that someone has to get to that age to really learn that. And
yeah.
I'm hoping more people will find that out, have that realization at a younger age. And Abigail said, without making ourselves vulnerable, we cannot connect. And that's a reward at the end of the day. Human connection is by definition an act of vulnerability.
Mm.
And I really like that too. It's what you always said about connection, connecting to a higher creative power, connecting to other people. Without vulnerability, we obviously cannot truly connect. And the last one, Diana said, for me, my desire to create is often overridden with my desire for perfection.
Mm.
And, perfectionism is a form of shame. It's that feeling of if I don't do everything perfectly, then what I am doing is shameful. So we all have this unique experience of shame, but it all roots back to the same thing. And it's just pretty amazing how universal this experience is.
Well, yeah. And also, this is part of the greater patriarchal wounds, right? Because it's hard not to be a perfectionist when all of our systems really are driven by hierarchy and ranking and competition and things like that. You said so many amazing things. One of them that, shame is not productive. And I used to say to especially women, like, guilt is not a
Yeah.
productive emotion unless it keeps you from doing something really, really bad.
Mhm.
But I know you're not going to do anything really bad, so it's not productive. Also, what you're touching on is a Jungian concept of a complex, right? So the reaction is the pattern, but what's going on right now, that's not causing, it's triggering it, but the reaction is from something very old that keeps being replayed. And the purpose of your unconscious, like doing that to you, is for you to find the origin, your origin story, right? So when you find the root of like, what is your earliest memory of when you felt that, like you did something, you were so happy, carefree, and proud of it, and something, it could have been one word from a teacher or from a parent or whatever it was, that at that tender age is imprinted in your body and it gets triggered then. And then, we also then develop a pattern to protect ourselves from that. And what's so great about your story, though, is that you do it anyway. So, what you've done is you've developed skills to talk yourself through it and do it anyway. But the twinge, I call it the twinge. The twinge is, perfectionism is also so, so complex. Like you can't even, it's a combination of things. So, oh, I love it. And I
You
really,
know,
go ahead.
yeah, what you said about that reaction being old, that it being part of something you grow up with,
Mhm,
that is something else that I didn't think about
mhm,
until I read Brene Brown's book, which is how much we can normalize just because we grew up with it. I moved here when I was 10 years old. I finished fifth grade in China. And the education system in China is very shame based. There's a lot of comparison. Kids are always compared to each other. It's always, well, that kid is doing more. Why aren't you doing it? Or look what
mm,
that kid's doing. You wouldn't want to be like that. And there's also a lot of public shaming.
mhm.
Kids who forget to do their homework are called up to the front of the class. We get hit with books, we get hit with sticks, we get chalk thrown at us, we thrown in the back of the room. When I talk about this stuff, people here are shocked, but I never thought this was abnormal. I thought this, and I've experienced all those things. And I was a kid who did my homework most of the time. I was a good student, and I still, anytime I messed up, there was a degree of public shaming that
Oh,
happens.
oh,
And that really ingrains itself
mhm.
in your brain. And even after I moved here, it's still a message that my parents often use. And I don't blame them because that's how they were raised as well. That's just what they know. I get compared to my peers all the time, whether it's positively or negatively. But it's a way of shaming when you compare kids to each other.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
yeah, to this day, I find I have a tendency to compare myself to everyone and everything. And it's like I say, it's a complex. It keeps coming and you don't even realize it's happening.
Yeah. Yeah. And we can hold these two things where your parents are part of a culture, they did this thing that harmed you, right? But we can separate that from our love for our parents, that they did
Right.
our best, whatever. But we can't like minimize the harm. And there was harm done. And what we do is we brush it off when we're young because that's what children do. And then this is the part of life when those things start coming up and they want to be addressed and explored and have a changing relationship with you, integrated in a way. And so to bring it into your life. And to also, this reminds me of when I do inner child work with my clients, that we circle back to the eternal child before they were corrupted by silly adults. I say silly adults, right? That don't know any better. And she's there and she wants to be pulled forward into your life now. So I love where you are on your journey. It's so beautiful. It's really instructive. I mean, it really is a great reflection of Carl Jung's theory of individuation, sort of you're becoming conscious of exploring your unconscious instead of your unconscious just like tossing you around in life. So, and I love it. I love that you're like asking people to share their experiences too. You're like creating this space for people to be vulnerable, to share their experience of vulnerability. I mean,
And
what a service.
everybody has that vulnerability to share.
Mhm. Yeah. And it's a beautiful vulnerability. So tell me about this quote you love from Brene Brown. I don't remember this one. Everybody's got different quotes that they latch onto.
Yes.
Mine was the courage one. Yours is this one. Vulnerability feels like truth and sounds like courage. And you said for you, it speaks deeply to creativity because being creative is to show our truth and being brave enough to let the world see it. So you kind of like talked about it earlier, but like, yeah, just tell us more about like that quote, what it means for you.
So Brene Brown said if we really take a good look at ourselves in our most vulnerable moments, we realize those are the moments that actually require the most courage. But rather than focusing on our own bravery, we focus on our fear. I felt this when I first started to put my original writing out into the world, and there's such a fear of being ridiculed, being called a bad writer, or somebody saying, "You're not original, somebody else already did that," etc., etc. But you know what? So what? As long as you're not blatantly plagiarizing someone else, who cares if you're not the best or you're not the most original? There's like 8 billion romance books out there. Do you think they're all original? No, that's not how that works. All you have to do is be authentic. And that took me a long time to understand what that means. To have a voice that is you without imitating other people, a voice that makes you feel real. Just, be you, write what you like. There is no shame. And that's courage. And Brene Brown also said we should not put too much value on the opinion of those who are not in the same arena as us. She compares it to a gladiator fight. There's people in the crowd who are yelling and jeering and shouting. And then there's a few people who are in the arena fighting with you, blood and sweat. And it's not the opinion of the crowd that matters. It's those who are fighting the same fight and perhaps the ones who you invited to watch your journey. In that, I compare that to the family and friends who give you your support,
Yeah.
your editors, your beta readers, people who you invited into your journey because they're the ones who understand your courage
Yeah.
and they're often the ones who are vulnerable the same way you are. And for a creative, this means focusing on those people and not the rest of the world. And
Yeah.
this is not easy because the world is very, very noisy, especially nowadays. But I'm slowly learning that when you feel vulnerable, it's when you also have the most courage, and that's something to be proud of.
I
That's not something to be feared.
I love it. And also, I suspect that those with the most stringent opinions are not in the game. And so it is easy for them. It's a kind of projection. In fact, it reveals sort of their disappointment in themselves. And
Yes,
so, and you're familiar with the concept that wounded people wound people,
yes,
right?
hurt
So,
people hurt
pe-
others.
yeah.
Do you remember when Simone Biles chose not to? participate in a major competition because of her mental health. I saw that
Yes.
it was really vulnerable of her to
Yeah.
come out and say, I am not in the right state of mind to do this. And all these people just bashed her for it. And if you really stop to think, like, she put herself out there. Who are you to bash her when she says, I have limits, I can't do this? Like, what are you doing to
Well, I mean, it's even worse than that. It's kind of like, how dare you not do this for me?
that's right.
How
That's right.
dare you like keep this experience from me? Like you belong to me. It's like a possession, a
Mhm.
narcissism. It's oh despicable.
Yeah, it's awful. And with internet these days, you hear these opinions more and more. It gets harder and harder to filter them out.
I
So it
almost
takes a lot of courage to
I
filter them
almost
out.
I almost think, and I have a wonderful Twitter community, and it's really a great platform for me because people like to talk to each other, but we just do it through writing, and I ask a lot of reflection questions, and we engage, and I have found that Twitter for many people is a place where they can be vulnerable and find like people that, like literally for some people, being out and about is dangerous,
Yeah.
so they can actually feel safer connecting with other people like them on Twitter. And I I have this theory, we have so much sort of climaxing of clinging to old stagnant beliefs
Hmm.
and sort of this regression into intolerance and hatred and projection and all of this. So what's our role? So those people aren't able to be self-aware enough to realize that they're projecting so that because they cannot be self-reflective about the root of their anger, right? So, and which is why people like that like to trigger other people
Yes.
because it mirrors back to them, but they're not understanding that it's not that they're getting pleasure from triggering people, it's that they're avoiding this work, right? So what do we do? Well, when we're sensitive and triggered, that is the work for us. Why? Why does this thing somebody say trigger me? It's just a thing. Like, why is it? And so it's an invitation when you're triggered. It's an invitation, it's the doorway to explore that root so that when you sort of have this new relationship, you can respond to them more effectively and correctly in an emotionally neutral way. So I have this theory that that's kind of what's going on in a collective is that these people are pushing another group of people to really become even more self-aware at a deeper level so that we can take correct action. And then these oppositions, as Carl Jung would say, these two opposing things kind of fighting with each other eventually will coalesce, will push a transcendent third, a new idea having to do with how we are living as human beings. So anyway, that's just my thought about it.
Yes.
But
I love that.
thank you for sharing more. You really have expanded your consciousness about the deeper meaning of your life experiences over the last couple of years. And I'm wondering what else you'd like to share or like advice for my listeners and viewers when it comes to creative expression in their lives because there's this thing about I'm not an artist because it's actually not the point. That's not the point. The unconscious wants to create. And I'm thinking about one of my clients who after just meeting for a couple of sessions and he thought he wanted to meet with me about one thing, but the unconscious, it has its own agenda, and then that turned into something else. And then in the meantime, and he had lost his son to suicide like 8 years before, and he
Oh,
suddenly had this like story swirling around in his head. And I said, well, you have to write it. And he didn't even like I helped him actually. He wouldn't have thought to write it. He was just kind of plagued, and not plagued in a bad way, but like it wouldn't go away. And after he wrote it, it was like, I don't know, 2,500 words. I was like, "Oh, I could see this being a movie because it dealt with death, but it was so unique and creative in how he was telling this story. And it wasn't about his son. It was just that experience. Like prompted a new kind of idea around our relating to death. And I said, "Oh my gosh, I think you should just like work on publishing this." But the point was not to publish it. That's all he needed to do actually was bring it out on paper and express it. And in doing that, it shifted something in him. I don't know what he ever did with it, but it wasn't the point to go out there and share it with anybody. So anyway, so yeah, so like just wondering in general about creativity, because it's not always about creating art. And of course, we have art therapy, but you don't need to go to an art therapist. So I don't know, whatever you want to share about to my listeners about getting them to think about creative expression differently in their own lives.
We live in a time where people are increasingly isolated from each other. Even before the pandemic, the internet, the digital tools, we used to live in communities.
Mhm,
That's how people naturally lived. These days, we're isolated, especially in the Western culture.
mhm,
We are more and more segregated from each other. But the truth is, we still want to connect. And creativity is a thing that we all share. I don't believe anyone is not creative.
mhm.
They're just not ready to be vulnerable with it yet. Creativity takes courage, and it doesn't occur to people that this is a matter of just being willing to put yourself out there. And not even to the world. Like your client, you just said he
Mhm,
wrote it just for himself. It's something he wanted to do. Sometimes we're not willing to be vulnerable with ourselves.
mhm.
We worry that if we put what we're imagining out there into the room and it takes up space, we're going to judge ourselves for it. And we should never judge ourselves. We should never judge ourselves because it's always good to be creative.
Yeah,
It's
in fact, like the reason many people won't journal, even something journaling is a creative expression. It's taking all the swirling stuff inside you, but as soon as you put it onto paper, then you can see it and it's real.
yeah,
And also you get a little distance from it though. So you
that,
can,
that's right.
you can be like be a little bit more objective. Oh, I love it.
You stand back and look at this thing that you created. And when that happens, you worry that the reaction that
Yeah.
you as a person is going to have is the same reaction you worry other people will have.
Yeah.
If you create a person, if you create a painting and you when you put it on your wall, you're gonna worry other people are gonna think it looks bad. And even if you don't think that, you're worried that you're gonna think it looks bad. Why would you think it looks bad? Because other people might think it looks bad. So sometimes that last fear is of ourselves. We
W-
can't be, we can't stand to be vulnerable to ourselves.
Well, you just hit on something very core, having to do with projection. So our fear of other people criticizing us is just a reflection of our own inner
Yes,
criticism, right? So oh, they're what I'm afraid of, when really it's not. It's mirroring back that you're really afraid of your own being intimate with your own self.
you're afraid that you are going to be disappointed in you. Because if you're
Yeah.
not disappointed in you, you don't care what other people
Yeah,
think.
right.
So
I love it. I forgot to share the story. Oh, this just gets to sort of how the unconscious seeks to create, not to be admired by other people. It's a way that we grow our expand our consciousness. So this particular client, a male, who's probably about 40, and he's a coder and he's very antsy. Like he would love to just go live on a prairie. He like would like to get back to basics. So anyway, we're having a conversation. Well, there were two things. I recently recorded a guided meditation that includes reflections about self intimacy. So even being vulnerable with self and that experience. And then there's a guided meditation. And after he listened to that, he got a rush and he used AI to create these really odd, kind of disturbing images. And then he also made music and he put this video out. He had never done TikTok before. He just like was swept up in a creative moment. So that's when you know it's not just you.
Mhm.
And he shared this video with his music and using AI, and it got 10,000 views. And he was like, "What just happened?" And this is the same client that after we had a session and I was talking about one of my favorite topics is the deeper meaning of sexual attraction and arousal, that it's creative energy, creative intelligence, and we misunderstand it for wanting to have like literal sex. And after that conversation, literally 2 hours later, he sent me a short story. And it was
Wow.
about this concept. And I was like, "Oh, dude, I just want to publish this for you." And he's like, "Well, maybe I should edit it." And I'm like, "I don't think it needs editing. For what?" I just what came out of you totally expressed the concept that we are talking about, and that like manifested as a new creative expression. And so, every this is what you mean. Like everyone has
Yes.
creativity.
And that's authenticity too.
Oh my,
Have
yes.
you heard of the flow state that
Oh yeah.
people talk about?
Yeah.
The flow that people experience when they're deeply ingrained in something like it's usually something creative.
Hmm.
The state where you are just creating and time passes without you realizing. That's usually what happens when you are authentic. And the authentic self is creative.
Yeah.
Everyone's authentic self is creative because it longs to be expressed, and what is art except self-expression?
Yes. And what makes it really vulnerable is that when you are really open, is that there is this thing flowing through you, which means your mind is not in control. And
Yes.
that's the vulnerability part. So it requires this trust of self, capital S, which is the bridge to the realm, the cosmos, nature, God, divine, whatever you want to call it, quantum realm. And so because there's uncertainty about what will be the ultimate right creation, that's sort of the fear, because what is creativity? It comes from the unknown, from the unconscious. I mean, right? It doesn't come from the mind. The mind thinks it knows what it knows, whatever. Being creative requires the vulnerability. Oh, so juicy. I love it.
And something that I've been trying to incorporate in my life in terms of vulnerability is meditation. I never used to meditate, and I think it's because I got some bad advice on how to do it when I first tried it,
Yeah.
was you have to empty your mind and have
Mm.
it stay empty. So
Impossible.
yeah, that didn't work. But in the last few years, I've learned that you're supposed to let your mind go where it wants and without judgment.
Yeah.
And that's a vulnerable thing. That's a vulnerable thing to do because your mind will want to go places that you maybe don't want to think about when you're not meditating. Things you don't want to dwell on, things you don't want to chew on, things you just don't want to bring to the forefront of your mind. And I think that has a parallel in creativity. To be creative, you have to allow yourself to enter the flow state and to be open to
Yeah.
what is in the back of your mind that maybe came from you, maybe came from other sources, maybe came from the greater realm or whatever it is you want to call it. That part, I'm not a hugely spiritual person, but I acknowledge that your brain goes places that you can't control.
Hmm.
And what is that? Who knows? There are aspects of it that you cannot control, and that's a vulnerability. That's
Well, right. And if you're a brain person, even science
Mm,
confirms that up to 90% of who you are is influenced by mysterious unconscious forces.
mm,
So that is terrifying
yeah.
that you don't know. Pretty much there's always an unconscious agenda at play when you're taking any kind of an action. So, but that then also can be really interesting, and you
Mhm.
can get really creative about like, aha, I know there's like this underlying other agenda. I wonder what it is.
And that's why we're all always struggling to understand ourselves.
Yeah.
As we get older, as we learn more about the world but there's always more to learn about ourselves. And that's because there's so much unknown. Even
Oh,
within our own minds, there's so much unknown, and we're always trying to learn more.
yeah. I'm gonna study myself for the rest of my life. I'll probably
That's
never
right.
figure it all out. So, this has been so rich conversation. And again, appreciating your being vulnerable to sharing your relationship with vulnerability and how you're, just coming into deeper relationship with yourself. And of course, I'm going to put all these links down to all your books and whatever you want me. But how would you like people to find you, support you, follow you, keep in touch so that they know when your next books come out?
Well, my website is jdedwin.com. My email is author@jdedwin.com. You can sign up for my newsletter on my website. That's how I mainly contact my readers these days. And I'm always open to emails and, chatting. It's just sign up for the newsletter or email me. Always welcome.
I do really love your emails, your newsletter. You don't bombard people. It doesn't come all the time. And when it does, it's not overwhelming. Like mine has so much stuff in it. It just has like a simple idea. And I love that people respond back to you. So, and is there anything that we didn't touch on that you want to make sure that you'd like to share that you want to bring into our conversation?
No, I think we got everything. It was
Yeah.
a pleasure talking to you as always.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, thank you so much for a deeper dive into your creative life. And I really appreciate you as a friend and a writer colleague.
Anytime. Thank
Uh,
you for the opportunity as
Yeah.
always.
Yeah. Can't wait for your next series. So I hope you enjoyed my conversation with JD Edwin. Links to her books are in the description box, as well as links to our first two conversations. They're interesting. And remember, our soul, our unconscious, speaks to us in many ways to get our attention and prompt us to explore something deep inside. And this includes books. At the right moment, reading or watching the right story, a new insight, a new connection might arise that could change your day or the trajectory of your whole life. I'll also include links to a chapter from my soul book about Jungian film theory, another way we receive stories, which includes many of my stories of how I made sense of parts of my life through film experiences, and some other blog posts about my reflections on some films, including the recent film Poor Things. I had a really great conversation with a friend of mine who we're both obsessed with movies, but he comes at it from a different angle than me. So, anyway, until next time.